When you've got questions, he always has an answer. It's Sean Hannity, this afternoon at 2, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560. The Answer.
Dan and Amy, as I mentioned, arguably the greatest president of the 20th century, I would argue that. Ronald Wilson Reagan from Tampico, Illinois.
Or Tampico. Tampico?
Dixon, raised in Dixon. Eureka College, football standout.
Yeah.
President of SAG, pitchman for GE, time for choosing speech at the 64 convention.
Worked in Des Moines in the radio there.
Governor of California, yeah, Cubs games.
Yeah, broadcast company. What else
Governor
did
of
he-
California.
You know what? He was just gorgeous. And he was loyal to Nancy, and they had such a beautiful relationship.
Yeah, much better than the
Those
one with
love
Jane
letters.
Wyman, that was for sure.
Yeah, that didn't work out so well.
He had something that we've been discussing low these past couple of years. He had a special prosecutor investigate his administration over the Iran-Contra matter. And you remember that was Lawrence Walsh, and you had Bill Casey. They were able to sort of blame the dead guy. Do that routine. Bill Casey, the former CIA director, so that was useful. But
Can't interview him because he's dead.
Interesting how he handled it, survived, still regaled as a great president, which he was. And there's a new book about Reagan. So many have been written, many great books. This looks to be another with some perspective on Reagan that is relevant today, like, as I mentioned, as the head of the Screen Actors Guild, sort of developing serious arguments against communism back in the day when the Reds were overrunning Hollywood, which I'm not sure how much that's changed. That, among other topics covered in Larry Schweikart's new book, Reagan, the American President. And Professor Schweikart is going to be in town. Heartland Institute, our friends over at the Heartland Institute, are sponsoring a dinner with him Wednesday, April 24th. It's going to include insights from these never-before-seen papers from the Reagan Presidential Library that are included in Larry Schweikart's book. If you want to join him for dinner at the Heartland Institute, just down the road from us, Arlington Heights, tickets are available at heartland.org. That's heartland.org, and we're pleased to be joined by historian and retired professor from the University of Dayton, the Flyers.
Oh,
Larry
I actually knew that one.
You knew that one. Larry Schweikart, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, guys. No, it's my pleasure.
Why don't we just start there, since that's in the news, the Mueller report. The perspective and the approach that Reagan took to the special prosecutor that investigated Iran-Contra in his administration during his second term.
Well, of course, Walsh came in '86 and was went for 5 years. So that was a long special prosecutor. So he's basically investigating Reagan a couple of years after he's out of office.
Right.
Reagan's approach was just like Trump's. Full transparency, ordered all papers handed over, all witnesses to go before the congressional committees. He requested that Congress also set up an investigation, which they did. And basically no investigation anywhere could turn up a single piece of paper that showed that Reagan had any knowledge of what Oliver North was doing. That's kind of the upshot.
I wanted to also pick up on what I just mentioned, his time at the Screen Actors Guild dealing with Hollywood, something else that every president who's not a Democrat has to deal with, Trump being no exception. Hollywood's hair is on fire, just like the D.C. press corps, over the Mueller report. And also, particularly with the rise of socialism as au courant in Democrat circles again, Reagan's time at the Screen Actors Guild fighting communism before he did it at the presidential level.
Right. When he comes into the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, as it's called, it was riddled with communists at the top levels, not so much the rank and file. And Reagan was shocked when he got into some of these meetings, and they couldn't even pass a resolution praising capitalism or condemning communism. He goes to a famous after-SAG meeting with Olivia de Havilland and James Roosevelt and some others, and he keeps looking at Olivia Havilland all night, kind of strangely, and she says, "You're looking at me strangely all night." And she says, "I always thought," and he said, "Well, I always thought you were one of them," meaning the communists. And she said, "Well, I always thought you were one of them too." So it was really widespread. But of course, he knocks it out of the park when he goes to testify before HUAC, House Un-American Affairs Committee, and they're expecting him to really lambaste Hollywood and really talk about how dirty Hollywood is. And he basically tells Congress, I think we've cleaned it up. I think we purged most of the communists. And then he launches into the most amazing defense of free speech. He says, I would never want to see free speech curtailed or anything done to affect the First Amendment. And he starts quoting Jefferson to the congressmen, or just kind of sitting there listening to him with their mouths open. So it was a great defining moment for Reagan.
I just want a quick follow-up. You mentioned Olivia de Havilland, that exchange, that's a fun exchange. Do you think Reagan would have been better opposite her in the heiress than Montgomery Clift?
Well, here's my take on Reagan in his acting years. Yeah. I don't think he ever put himself fully into acting. I think probably the only two parts he really threw himself into were George Gipp and then in King's Row. But other than those two, first of all, Reagan had a thing about playing anything other than himself. He didn't like playing villains. He only played one villain in his entire life, and it was his last movie, The Killers, which was terrible by all admissions.
It really was terrible.
And he never would have done what Heath Ledger did, kind of throwing himself into the part, or Christian Bale, where you diet down and lose 200 pounds so that you can look like some anorexic guy. So
we call them anorexic,
I think
by the way. Yes.
Reagan just he didn't throw himself into acting the way he threw himself into politics.
Wow. So President Trump, are there any? He's compared himself several times to Ronald Reagan. Do you think that's fair to Ronald Reagan?
Yep, absolutely. There's an appendix in the book, comparisons between Trump and Reagan. The two men are each the oldest man to reach the presidency when they go in. Each was divorced. Each had adult children. Each was badly underestimated by their opponents. But you mentioned SAG. Mm-hmm. Reagan and Trump are the only two presidents ever to hold a real SAG working card. I think a couple of people did cameos and may have gotten one for that. But both Reagan and Trump held a SAG card for actually working as actors.
Some of the other never-before-seen papers that are cover or that cover topics in your book that haven't been covered with the depth in previous Reagan biographies.
Well, let's look at the economy real quick. The knock against Reagan and his team early on was that they were always providing rosy. That was a word that the journalists always used, because back then they had their template just like they do today, right? They were providing rosy economic forecasts. Well, what I found in the papers was that quite the contrary. Reagan and his team deliberately understated what they put out to the public. In private, they thought the economy would do even better, which it did. The economy lined up with their private expectations, but they were afraid to put that out in public, and so they dampened down expectations in public, and even then they were called rosy.
Well, and one other comparison between Reagan and Trump that I find is, even though the stylized recollections of the D.C. press corps is, it was a less partisan time in the 80s when he was president because he and Tip O'Neill got on so well. Clark Clifford called him an amiable dunce. The D.C. press corps thought he was going to bring nuclear winter because of his belligerent approach to the Soviet Union and to communism in general, including in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, he was a danger to freedom. He was going to institute a totalitarian state. All the things that they say about Trump today, they were saying about Reagan in the 80s.
Yeah, and in fact, remember Ted Kennedy writes his letter to the Soviet Union leadership offering his help. What can I do to keep Reagan from getting reelected in 1984? So they absolutely hated him. The only area where you might see a change is that at the time, the main three news networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, would routinely grant Reagan an hour or an hour and a half to do a national public address. And usually they did not have a panel of Democrats right after that analyzing the speech. They had their news people analyzing it, but they didn't give so-called equal time after the speech. And today people say, well, why doesn't Trump go on TV and make a speech? A, I don't think they're going to give him the time, and B, all the time before and afterward is going to be used up by opponents who are going to criticize every single thing in the speech.
He is Larry Schweikart. He got out of academia just in the nick of time, a former professor at Dayton University. He's got a new book, Reagan, the American President, and he's going to be in Chicago at with our friends over at the Heartland Institute Wednesday, April 24th for a dinner where he'll talk about the book, sign some books, sell some books. Tickets are available at heartland.org. That's heartland.org. And Wednesday, April 24th, Larry Schweikart previewing his book, Reagan, the American President, Reagan. Larry, thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with your book. Appreciate it.
Great. Hope to see you out there at Heartland.
Definitely. Take care.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.